On behalf of CPE, Bay Resistance, Arab Resource and Organizing Center, and the Anti-Police Terror Project, welcome to a special emergency session of our weekly Palestine Solidarity announcements. For those of you who are new to these calls, which usually take place on Fridays, PSAs are a space for us to provide the most recent political developments and updates on what's happening in Gaza and how organizers, especially in the Bay Area, can plug into solidarity work for Palestine. We're joining you on a Tuesday today because of the rapid escalation of events taking place in and around Rafah, which is being bombed and occupied by Israeli soldiers and US weapons as we speak. For weeks, we've highlighted the innumerable warnings from Palestinians, the UN, international humanitarian organizations, and progressive organizations, organizers, and governments globally that an invasion of Rafah would represent the most dramatic and destructive escalation in this months-long genocide, particularly because Israel has deliberately pushed Palestinians to the border with Egypt, and now more than 1 million Palestinians are concentrated and trapped in Rafah. We've also heard conflicting reports in the last 24 hours about the prospects of a ceasefire deal, with news that Hamas has agreed to an Egyptian Qatari brokered set of terms as recently as yesterday, followed by an announcement from Netanyahu's government that they would still proceed with the operation in Rafah while sending a delegation to discuss terms. All while our government in the United States continues to obfuscate, publicly stating that the process is delicate and that CIA Director Bill Burns is working within the negotiations, yet failing to acknowledge that the Biden administration had claimed Rafah was a red line, and nonetheless provided arms unabated to Israel for months leading up to this moment. To help us make sense of all these developments, which are changing by the hour, as an international student intifada grows and faces increasingly brutal repression, we'll be joined later by Samar Arabi from Iraq. But for now, we are lucky at the last minute to be joined by a special guest who is actually in Rafah today, who we've been connected to through our comrades at Jewish Voice for Peace and Palestinian Youth Movement. And it's Bridget, who is a nurse, is a midwife, who is working in Rafah with a medical organization named Glios. And we're going to actually talk to her right now to get a sense of what's the situation on the ground right now in Rafah, and have her talk a little bit about her work there. Bridget, thank you for joining us. Please tell us a little bit about yourself and your work in Rafah and what the situation is right now.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. Thank you for having me. I am here in the capacity as a midwife, and have been working at Emirati Hospital in Rafah, which is the last maternity hospital in all of Gaza Strip. Emirati Hospital was originally created to serve the population of Rafah, which is relatively small. So there's only a couple of labor beds. There's not a huge area for postpartum support. But it has had to take on a very large capacity of all of the displaced people, internally displaced people who have made it to Rafah. So this is over 1 million people. What this looks like in practice is that births have gone from 70 births a month to over 1,500 births a month. Most of the people who are actually working within the hospital are displaced people themselves who are living in tents. There is not enough supplies in any way, shape, or form. Moms are not getting any prenatal care, any medical care throughout their pregnancy. They're thin, their babies are small. There's really upsetting kind of diagnoses of congenital issues, and intrauterine demise, that's happening kind of at the time of arrival at the hospital. Beyond that, because there is no sewage, there's a huge outbreak of hepatitis A. There are no vaccines, regularly scheduled vaccines for children. Any chronic health care issue has been put to the wayside, as we've heard many times before. The problem is that now, with the escalation that has happened in East Rafah, things are looking significantly worse. East Rafah was, the bombing started in East Rafah a few days ago. And then earlier this morning, Tuesday night here in Rafah, Israel took the Rafah border crossing. now making it so there is no exit out of Gaza, and that includes for humanitarian workers like myself. Um, what the closing of this crossing means too is that there is no more fuel coming in, there's no more medical supplies coming in, and there really isn't like a way to get out. For the most part, the only way that medical care workers or medical supplies were getting into Gaza was through this crossing. So the loss of it is significant and is only going to further escalate the already dire kind of humanitarian aid crisis that's going on here. Um, the implications for further ground invasion are significant. Uh, People are being told a displaced population of like already 75% of people at that are displaced and are now being told to move back up to Han Yunis, to Al Mawasi. And the problem there is that there is nothing left. In particular, Han Yunis is demolished. So there really is no place else to go. Um, as I talk to you now, we've been hearing bombing all day. There was carpet bombing last night. There's drones. Um, there is a lot of kind of emotional roller coaster up and downs of the bombing and then hearing about ceasefire yesterday and all of that. Um, there's also a really huge concern as people are now displaced, some for like the fifth or sixth time, about the 14,000 unaccompanied minors that are in Gaza, and how they will be taken care of and shepherded appropriately um, to safety, if safety exists, which I don't necessarily think it does.
Thanks, Bridget. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about what you and the other medical staff there are trying to do in the meantime as the conditions worsen, given that there is no further supplies that are coming in. What are sort of the immediate needs that you're trying to address in the current moment?
Yeah, I think we're just trying to work with what we've got. It is a day by day basis of what we have kind of on hand. One of my colleagues in this delegation works in primary care, and she just has to check to see if, okay, there's like one antibiotic you can give children here today, and like that's all you're getting for anything. The same goes obviously for adults. Um, I think, yeah, I think that one of the things that we're trying to do the most is just to provide a container of empathetic exchange because that's kind of what we have left. Um, over $1 million worth of supplies have crossed the border with delegations. Delegations are super important because supply trucks are not getting in. We literally carry the stuff on our back into Gaza. And furthermore, the fuel shortage that is now happening with the border closure is really concerning because, you know, we have like some supplies here that we don't know where to go or to put it, and we don't want to waste the fuel getting there. Um, so it it's also hard to kind of figure out where we stay, and who we support. If we stay in Rafah and support the people who are deciding to stay here or not, if we try to go up to Han Yunis, where there's actually no infrastructure, like there's no buildings or anything like that. Um, it's definitely a rock and a hard place type of situation, to put it lightly.
Have you heard anything from either, I know that you're based in the US, but from the US government or from the UN or from any of those other international bodies about, how they directed you in terms of how they expect things to happen in the next few hours?
Not it changes minute by minute. I wouldn't say that there has been anything in particular. We were told earlier today that we would be exiting actually through Israel, which has a huge amount of implications for us, for a lot of reasons. Being questioned at the border, being detained at the border, not being able to go to certain places in the future because of passing through Israel. We have been told that the UN is trying to brokerage a deal between Israel to create some sort of passing that is open for us. We're praying that it is back to Egypt. Um, but otherwise, it is a minute by minute process. We're hearing conflicting stuff about whether things are going to be contained to East Rafah and Rafah Crossing, or if things are going to continue to go more centrally into Rafah.
Bridget, you know that, I mean, I know that you're from Oakland originally, and I think you probably have a sense of that a lot of the folks on this call today and right now are actually Bay Area based organizers and activists. I'm sure a lot of them have been out in the streets and doing what they can do, but not to put any more pressure than is already on you, given all the work that you're doing there with our Palestinian brothers and sisters. But I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about what you are hoping other people outside of Gaza right now should be thinking about doing in terms of our mobilization efforts and in terms of whom we should be pressuring at this current moment to intervene.
I will say that, at least on a kind of emotional and spiritual level, that what is happening on college campuses has been extremely felt. Everybody who talks to me mentions that first. And it feels like kind of the final domino and until a few days ago was a really huge point of hope for everybody. And I think that that's important morale wise. I think that nobody goes harder than the Bay. And I'm proud to be proud to be from Oakland and from the Bay. And I think we've been doing a great job. It's just we have to keep it up. I mean, like who more can we talk to? It's our elected officials. It's Joe Biden. It's all of these things. Um, but it's we are at a breaking point where this is it, you know. Um, so just keeping doing what we're doing. Yeah.
Bridget, is there anything else that you wanted to add just in terms of what others, from the perspective of some of the humanitarian workers there? I wanted to, obviously express our profound gratitude for your courage and bravery and solidarity with the patients you're treating. But before we let you go and let you go back to your work, we wanted to give you an opportunity to just make any other um, requests or statements to the audience today.
I mean, I think the thing that I just have been most impacted by is that, like at Emirati, everybody that I work with, it's not like people are just going to work in a genocide. People have been displaced themselves so many times. Like just it is constant. And still the steadfastness and the resilience and the strength and the pride of the Palestinian people is constantly through the roof. And I just hope that we do everything that we can to continue to sustain that for them. There's the word that keeps coming to mind for me throughout all of this is dignity. Um, Especially as a midwife, it's my job to provide a dignified birth for both, the birthing person and for their baby, as they come into this world and they go through this big transition. And I pray that, the babies that I'm catching and that I'm seeing are going to grow old in a free Palestine. And I think the thing that I'm hearing also is a big concern for a lot of people that I work with is like, okay, ceasefire, and then what next? And I think that like coalition building about how we rebuild and we continue to support the sovereignty of the Palestinian people after all of this, because it will end, is so important. And we need to think critically about how we're going to sustain our efforts in that.
Bridget, I can't thank you enough for taking time out of all the critical work you're doing. We are hoping and praying and working to make sure that you and all of the other patients and refugees who are in Rafah right now stay safe. And we look forward to hearing from you again. And please, if there's another opportunity for us to help you share the stories of all the Palestinians, especially the Palestinian mothers and children who are fighting for their survival, please don't hesitate to reach out again.
I will for sure. Thank you so much. Thanks for doing what you're doing.
Thanks, Bridget.
Thanks.
All right, everyone. Thank you again to our comrades at PYM and JVP for putting us in touch with Bridget and for all the work that she's doing. We will try to share a little bit more about the hospital where she's working at and what's going on there later on in our follow-up email. I'd like to bring up Samra Arabi from AROC to give us a little bit more of an update on all that's going on. Samra, it's been not just a few days since you and I did another PSA, and it's been quite an escalation, as Bridget has detailed, and a lot to be concerned about, not only in terms of those who are in the least um, able position to take care of themselves, and like those who are in the neonatal unit and the patients who are in the hospital who are already injured or incapacitated due to the violence that they experienced after being displaced, but Now we have a totality of more than 1 million Palestinians in a very tight space in Rafah, and all sorts of conflicting reports, as Bridget mentioned. So help us make sense a little bit about what's been going on the last 24 hours.
Thanks so much, Thomas. It's great to be here, and yeah, I will do my best. It is a rapidly evolving and constantly changing situation that I think is hard for anyone to really make sense of right now. But I thought it would be most useful. Uh, I think, given that a lot of us are feeling a little bit of whiplash right now from thinking that, a ceasefire might have been happening, that the end of the war may have been around the corner to the worst outcome that we've been fearing for months, that it would be good, I think, to sort of ground and contextualize both of those processes as they've been happening, and to see if we can derive some sense of the motivations for both the ceasefire negotiations and the Rafah offensive and what direction they might go. I think personally, my guess here is that there's two big directions right now, and the situation is in so much flux that we actually have a lot of power over which direction things go in. But we'll come back to that when we get to the end. Yeah, I really want to thank Bridget for, I think, giving a great overall contextualization of what things look like on the ground right now. By all accounts, it seems like an unadulterated horror. And I think this happening immediately after Hamas agreed to the ceasefire is hardly a coincidence. And I think there's a lot that we can learn from the sort of steps that got us to this point. The first of which I think is a sort of understanding of who's been involved in these ceasefire negotiations, right? You've got um, uh, Israel and Hamas, obviously, as the two parties negotiating and mediated by Qatar and Egypt, with the US playing a role, but not a mediator. And the specific role that the US plays has actually changed over time. And we'll come back to that too in a little bit. But just to note that, um, that there's like really diverging interests, obviously, of Israel and Hamas, but also of the other actors involved. And I think that's been part of what led us to this point. So, um, folks who have attended these before have seen some of my janky charts. This is my jankiest, but I think it's just important to, I think we generally think about the actors involved in this negotiation as being on a sort of line of how willing they are for the violence to end or for the war to stop. But I think it's useful for us to also consider things on a secondary axis, right? So in addition to just how people want, the extent to which people want the violence itself to end, but also what result from that ending of violence, right? So like what the new status quo will be. And obviously, Israel and Hamas are at opposite ends of this spectrum. For a series of reasons, it's really important for Israel to keep the war in Gaza ongoing, not only because the none of their stated ambitions for this war have materialized. Obviously, the war hasn't resulted in the freeing of prisoners. The war hasn't resulted in the eradication of Hamas, which continues to operate with relative impunity in the north. Not only because it's currently a PR disaster for them, but also because the end of the war is the end of the Netanyahu government. So Israel stuck in its corner, bottom left, Hamas obviously at the top right. And broadly speaking, Egypt strategically more aligned with Israel, Qatar a little bit more aligned with Hamas, but their positions haven't really moved over these few months. The actor that's moved is the United States. And importantly, the way that the United States is moving is laterally, right? No real difference in how much Palestinian control they want, but move from a willingness for the military operations to continue to a decision that the military operations need to end. And I think a big reason for that push and this giant push for these past few months for a 60-day ceasefire is that positions the Biden administration better vis-a-vis the upcoming elections, right? It's not the only reason, but that's a big one. So just to say, as the U.S. has moved along that one axis, right, there's been increasing pressure on Israel to accept the ceasefire deal, right? And we've been seeing for months now the U.S. saying that there is like a strong ceasefire deal on the table, and that Blinken just said a few weeks ago the only thing standing between the people of Gaza and the ceasefire is Hamas, right? And so this idea that all we need to do to end this violence is for Hamas to accept a ceasefire offering, and there's been broad Western pressure there. But in reality, it's been very clear that Israel has never been interested in a permanent ceasefire, but only a temporary cessation of hostilities. And the idea of an actual ceasefire is completely anathema, particularly to the Netanyahu administration, partly because Netanyahu himself is on the line for this failed war, and because the coalition government in Israel will collapse the minute there's a ceasefire, right? That's not even a question. That's a stated intent of the ministers in the unity cabinet that are even to the right of Netanyahu, right? They've said that a ceasefire would be raising a white flag if there isn't a Rafah operation. As a result of that, we've seen, we can now look at with retrospect in a really clear way that Israel has been sabotaging these ceasefire efforts deliberately and directly, right? So the last time things got really close, about a week ago, was when Netanyahu went out and said that the Rafah operation is going to happen whether or not a ceasefire is signed, and that sank the last round of negotiations. Last Wednesday, I believe. And then a shocking admission from U.S. officials involved in the negotiations for this past week have said explicitly Netanyahu and the war cabinet have not appeared to approach the latest phase of negotiations in good faith, right? So an admission that they're actively trying for it not to go through. So as a result of that, like, I think we can frame some of the other things that have been happening this week in that context, right? That given that the United States is now pushing for the ceasefire, given that the various parties have agreed to a broad set of terms, right, that Hamas for a couple of weeks now has said that they're amenable to. There was a sort of last-minute attempt, I think, on behalf of the Israelis to sink the negotiations, and I think part of that effort was actually the shutting down of Al Jazeera in Jerusalem, which happened specifically at the moment that these things were supposed to be finalized. I think as an attempt to get Qatar, right, the host country of Al Jazeera, to pull away from the ceasefire negotiations, which backfired. And a critical piece of why I think they've been pushing in this direction is that the final version of the ceasefire negotiations that Hamas agreed to yesterday isn't super meaningfully different than what was on the table a week before. It's this sort of three-stage process that involves the release of all remaining Israeli prisoners in Gaza, alive and dead, as well as the return of Palestinians to their homes, the provision of humanitarian aid, the end of direct military action in Gaza. But the sort of additional piece was a U.S. guarantee that after the first 40 days of the negotiation, that the violence would end permanently. If you've been attending past PSAs, we've been talking about how the core divergence between Hamas and Israel is that Hamas wants the permanent ceasefire, and Israel is refusing to make the ceasefire permanent. And so in a real surprise turn on the U.S. position in this process, that they offered Hamas a guarantee saying that regardless of what the Israelis want, the US will ensure that after 40 days, the war will be over and Israeli military action will stop. Part of the reason for this, and we could talk about this specific piece for an hour, but part of the reason for this is that for a long time, Blinken, the Secretary of State, has been the one involved in these negotiations, and Blinken is clueless, has like no conception of how to effectively like mediate between the parties, and his big thing right now is pushing for Saudi normalization. But these last rounds of negotiations have been led instead of Blinken by William Burns, the CIA director, who I think has a, for better or for worse, a better understanding of the dynamics of the Middle East. And so it's through Burns that this new guarantee was put out basically as a desperate attempt to get this war to end. That, I think, was the big clinching piece that for Israel was a hard no, impossible for them to agree to, again, because it signals the collapse of their government. It's an admission of the overall failure of the entire Gaza military operation. And it undermines their legitimacy, like on the global stage, right? Like once this war is over and journalists are allowed back into Gaza, we heard from Bridget, right? The things that the world will finally actually see is going to be devastating for the Israeli regime. And given those incentives and the fact that Israel is now flush with billions of dollars of new US aid, we talked about their ammunition shortages and staffing shortages earlier. Those can now be overcome. So the incentive for them in this moment is that a Rafah assault needs to happen as a save face attempt to keep the coalition alive, to buy time for Netanyahu, and to see if by some way the calculus on the ground can change, because right now it's a devastating defeat for Israel. It's not going to change, right? But they are sort of out of options. And from that desperation, I think, leads a certain willingness to sort of take wild risks, And so I think that means that the way that Gaza, like the Rafah campaign, is going to play out can go a lot of different ways, because the sort of underlying general constraint that armies sometimes face are out the window now. They've already lost. So it's a sort of last-ditch effort to do something. That push, as Bridget mentioned, is right now a relocation of about 200,000 people, a little bit more, from the area near the Kerem Shalom crossing in like southeast Rafah into Khan Yunis, which is like a 4-hour walk, depending on where you're coming from and where you're going to, across a devastated landscape with no infrastructure to support it. So like an inconceivable thing for them to do. But at the moment, not yet the sort of full Rafah invasion that people are worried is around the corner. Remember that there's 1.4 million people in Rafah, and this is an area of 200,000. So it's the start, what could be the start of a bigger operation, but could also be an attempt to say, look, we're going into Rafah without actually like committing the full resources and personnel and like sort of broad military advance that they would have to do, that would go against like what the United States has been warning them not to do, and that is militarily and logistically somewhat inconceivable for the IDF right now. So if we think about where they are, right, they've taken the border crossing with Egypt, and then are advancing in this column specifically to a small town called El Buyuk for some reason. I don't know why. If anyone has a sense of what is in El Buyuk, I'd love to hear it. But the taking of the border crossing itself, I think, is a really fascinating development. It's obviously horrific, and I think a lot of folks have seen the videos of that offensive, but the part of it that I find particularly interesting is that the taking of the border crossing is a direct violation of Israel's peace treaty with Egypt from 1973 that, specifically states things about the sovereignty of that border crossing. And despite the fact that they've violated that peace treaty, which Egypt has repeatedly previously said is a red line that can result in the annulment of the peace treaty, Egypt has said nothing, not one word, at least last that I checked, which implies to me, one of two things. One possible but less likely is that Egypt is so concerned about the scale of this thing that it can't say anything at all. It's basically beholden to like IMF money and the fear of a broader war. Or I think more likely that there have been negotiations behind the scene and an understanding that the Rafah crossing occupation is temporary and is ending very soon. So again, it's a sort of like optics game and not an actual control over the crossing. So one thing that I'll come back to that actually, but one thing to note, and this isn't verified yet, but folks on Twitter are saying that Israel informed Egypt that it's going to withdraw from the crossing in a day or so. So again, I think that implies to me that the goal here isn't like a long-term occupation of the crossing, but rather the optics of, like tanks, the fact that they've been putting out these videos of them hoisting Israeli flags at the border crossing, of them flattening I Heart Gaza signs with tanks, is optics for an Israeli base, right? That is keen to see in all its horror the Israeli military charging into Rafah, where they say like, they're going to root out Hamas or whatever. That's not a realistic military scenario. So this feels like it's an optics game. It obviously could be much, much worse than that, but that is how it's currently feeling. And if you look at the troop deployments in Rafah, they're actually continue to be rather small. So they're currently at 4 battalions, which across all of Gaza, which again, if you remember, is what they're claiming is the number of battalions that Hamas has just in Rafah. So if it was an attempt to like fully root out Hamas, they would be doing it with fewer military forces than Hamas has in the area, which doesn't make military sense. That's not to say, of course, that more battalions aren't incoming, just that at the moment, the infrastructure for a broader invasion is a little bit held back. And I think, as we close out, I'll talk a little bit about what I think that means. And I do want to be extremely clear here that when I say that, a sort of campaign for optics or a limited Rafah incursion doesn't imply that this isn't extremely deadly, horrifically violent, and very, very dangerous, not only for the people in Rafah, but for the globe as we descend into like more unmitigated slaughter of Palestinian people. The scope of the bombings that have been happening in Rafah just in the past 2 days is among the worst, I think, that has been inflicted on Gaza since October. So, a war for optics isn't light or easy, but at the moment, it's also not yet the sort of full-scale like assault into Gaza that it could be or will be potentially. So I think the vibe there, as I understand it, is that one of two things is happening. Israel is either trying to save face in a lost war to like end it with a bang, to say like, okay, we've gone through every part of Gaza and we've rooted out Hamas and just like do the bare minimum that they can do to placate the extremely hard right in Israel / actually most Israelis support what's happening in Rafah horrifically. Or this sort of like small, like early stage engagement in Rafah is a testing of the waters to see how much they can get away with, given that the entire, even Western world is condemning the Rafah offensive. They may be starting small, seeing how people react, and then ramping up as a result of what pressure they do or don't receive. And some good news on that front is that there is pressure, right? Not only obviously at the broad popular level from all of these mobilizations, the growing pariah statehood of Israel, but even from the Biden administration, which for the first time is now holding weapons shipments to Israel. So popular demands for the suspension of military aid to Israel for the first time are now materializing. And it's particularly fascinating that, you know, this story about ammunition shipments to Israel being paused, that came out yesterday, I think, but the shipment was from a week ago. So military shipments to Israel have been paused for a week now. So that pressure is already being applied, and the direction that that pressure goes in now will have a massive impact, I think, on the trajectory of what happens going forward. So if those arms embargoes hold, it's going to massively constrain the ability of the Israeli military to expand this operation further. And for once, we're in a position where we somewhat advantageously don't have to ask the US government or demand that the US government do a new thing, but to continue doing the thing they're doing now. And that's an easier ask, but one where I think pressure on elected officials is probably more important than it's ever been. So I would extremely strongly encourage you, if you have not yet, to reach out to your congressional representatives. The US Campaign for Palestinian Rights has a great petition online that you can use. If you just go to uscpr.org/Gaza call, and that just takes 1 minute to send a message to your elected representatives. Given that even moderate Democrats at this point are saying we should be withholding arms to Israel, this is the moment to seize that momentum and make sure that those policies actually get solidified. But also, this is the moment to show up, right? Like, we really need folks mobilized everywhere that they can be, and as strong of a showing of force as we can make, to make sure that people hear, right, that this Rafah assault is unacceptable and unsustainable and needs to end immediately, along with the war as a whole since October. So there is a mobilization today at 4 o'clock at Berkeley. I would really encourage you all to go. There is a link in the slides, but I'll mention some other ways you can get event information. There is another mobilization tomorrow, put on by Berkeley students, like Berkeley City students who are responding to like anti-student oppression of students who are standing up against the war. There's a vigil for Shireen Abu Akleh, the journalist who was murdered in Palestine. That vigil is on Saturday. And I would really encourage you to go to all of those things. And of course, critically, more broadly, there are all the student encampments across the Bay Area who all need your support, both in person and logistically, with supplies, with meals, and with your bodies. So I'd really encourage you to find encampments near you and see how you can support them. And then more broadly, I would just really encourage you to check out AROC's event calendar to see what other events around Rafah are coming up. There will be other mobilizations coming soon. So I would keep an eye on that, because I think that the size of those mobilizations is going to be an important determinant of local dynamics. And you can always text PSA to our alert number to get updates sort of immediate text updates on local events as they're developing. And if you want to stay involved on the sort of news and information front, would also recommend that you sign up for the Palestine Media Tracker to see like the latest news and analysis on Palestine. That's at palmediatracker.com. And yeah, just to note that I think to close, two things that I really want to highlight. One is that one, we're in an end game, right? This is the end of what started in October. And we don't know how it's going to end, but it is ending. And two, I think we have had a really meaningful impact on the trajectory of this up to this point. The reason that this Rafah assault is still at least somewhat constrained is a result of all of this popular mobilization and action. And we have even more impact now. This is like a critical wedge moment in global history. And I really encourage you all to take advantage of that moment and show up how you can and where you can for Palestine. And I think that closes me out. Thank you so much.
Samar, thank you so much for doing this on short notice and providing all of this analysis, and also for doing the part of this that I thought I would have to do, which is to do the announcements. And I do want to give a special thank you, because this is being done on short notice, to Jenny and Antonio, our ASL interpreters, for joining us on short notice, and for Annie from APTP, and for all of you for showing up. As Samar said, there is this mobilization happening today, in just a few short hours, and we do encourage folks to show up for that. There'll be another mobilization tomorrow at Old City Hall, which Samar mentioned, and then finally next week there'll be an action in Mountain View around Google's biggest conference here in the Bay Area. Of course, keep in mind that things are developing quickly, so there can be other mobilizations around Rafah that will probably take precedence over what other things may be planned over the course of this week. And so stay tuned to some of the social media handles that you know from the organizations that co-sponsor this, including AROC, APTP, Bay Resistance, and CPE, and of course our close comrades at Palestinian Youth Movement, Bay Area PYM, and Jewish Voice for Peace, among many others. And so please stay tuned and stay connected, and we hope to see you in the streets, because this is, as Summer has said, and also as Bridget said, no one goes harder than the Bay, and it's really important, given how impactful the student movements have been, particularly around today's action at UC Berkeley. I think this is, as Sarah was saying, this is a convergence, and it's also a convergence of not only what we've been doing all over the rest of the Bay, but also now at the campuses, that converging together with what's been happening in terms of the anti-war demonstrations at these facilities, and what's been happening in the streets of San Francisco and in Oakland. I think the numbers matter, and I think our outrage matters, and it matters to those who are in Rafah right now, who are looking to us to show up. So encourage everyone to show up. Thank you for joining us, and we will we'll be announcing other PSAs as they come. For now, this might be the PSA for this week, but please stay tuned. Thanks all.